Hello and welcome to Podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computation, such as training machine learning models, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. And they also have a new object storage service to make storing data for your apps even easier. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode today, to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. Having all of your logs and event data in one place makes your life easier when something breaks, unless that something is your Elasticsearch cluster because it's storing too much data. Chaos Search frees you from having to worry about data retention, unexpected failures, and expanding operating costs. They give you a fully managed service to search and analyze all of your logs from S3, entirely under your control, all for half the cost of running your own Elasticsearch cluster or using a hosted platform. Try it out for yourself at pythonpodcast.com/chaossearch, and don't forget to thank them for supporting the show. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Corinium Global Intelligence, Alluxio, and Data Council. Upcoming events include the Data Orchestration Summit and Data Council in New York City. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to learn more about these and other events, and take advantage of our partner discounts to save money when you register today. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Jonathan Biddle about his work to encourage and empower Wayfair engineers in their use of Python. So Jonathan, can you start by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Jonathan Biddle. I lead a team at Wayfair called Developer Acceleration. You can think of our team as essentially trying to help other teams become more effective. So I consider us a bit of a meta team in that regard. And a large part of that would be how we kind of drove a lot of Python adoption over the past, I'd say about 2.5 years at this point.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Yeah, pretty clearly, actually. So I'm a bit of definitely call myself a self-taught programmer. And the first part of my programming career was essentially taking over maintenance of some Perl scripts for a newspaper company. And I just taught myself that organically for a while, and eventually got introduced to Python by Zope, who we were using for our, they had a product called Z4M. It was powering a bunch of our websites. And I started to get interested in Python about 2006, and then really got into it in 2007 when I discovered Django. And I just fell in love with Python at that point. I think one of the things that stands out to me with Python is its emphasis on readability. And especially with Django, I could almost like intuit the API in a lot of cases. It seems so easy to get into and guide you towards best practices.
And you mentioned that now you're working in the team to help other engineers and teams at Wayfair discover and use Python for their particular projects. I'm wondering if you can start by describing a bit about the overall mission statement for you and your team at Wayfair and some of the origin story about how your group got started.
Sure, yeah, definitely. So we consider ourselves like effective in our mission if engineers, which there are about over 2,000 of at Wayfair and growing, if they're focused on actually delivering like business value and focused on the task at hand and not fighting with like standing up logging or figuring out how to get a project running in production or anything along those lines, we want to get them as quickly as possible onto like the meat of their problems and pave those roads. So that's like really what we're trying to do is reduce friction and get people adopting best practices to be really effective. And how we got into that is, it's kind of interesting. It's a little happenstantial. So maybe I should describe the scene at the time. This is just shy of 3 years ago. Python had 12 apps running at Wayfair, and give or take. And it was getting to the point where those applications really didn't have like a dedicated team behind them. And I happened to be in the meeting, we were talking about this. And as we were describing like what this team would be, at the time I was leading a very Java-centric team. I heard what they were asking for, and I'm like, oh my God, this sounds like my dream job to like figure out how to support and grow this Python ecosystem at Wayfair. So a friend of mine at the organization who came from the same startup as me we got together and we talked about like how we could actually do this, and we just got into it and had to figure out like how to create an actual like Python platform team from essentially absolutely nothing, and try and grow adoption.
And you mentioned that at the time you first started, there were roughly 12 apps being built and maintained at Wayfair that were using Python. I'm wondering if you can characterize some of the different ways that it was being used and some of the other primary languages that have been common throughout Wayfair.
So there's a lot of PHP at Wayfair. There's also, I'd say, Java, obviously JavaScript, .NET, and Python was a bit of an edge case at the time. It was used predominantly to productionize a data science model of some type. It came in, I believe, the very first Python app at Wayfair was essentially a way of serving a data science model to the e-commerce experience. So you can imagine like you're writing a PHP app on the front end, and then behind the scenes, it's proxying that to a Python service. Like there's a Flask service in the background. So that was like how Python first came to the organization. It's grown quite a bit since then, since we started to like really make it easier and easier to use. But yeah, at the beginning, it was really about serving data science models to various types of systems.
And for programs and projects that are engineering focused at Wayfair, what's involved in the overall selection process for determining which languages are a good fit and what the overall technology stack is? Is that something that is sort of designed by committee, or is each team left to their own devices to figure out what works? Is there sort of an approved list of technologies that can be used? I'm just curious how that manifests at Wayfair specifically.
Yeah, so I'd say it's a bit of some of those, mainly the latter two. Generally, teams have a fair degree of freedom to figure out what has the best fit to purpose. We encourage everyone to be very pragmatic about that. Some languages have different, say, characteristics and strengths and drawbacks. Maybe really strong open source libraries that would be a good fit. But really, we want to trust teams to kind of use their best judgment. But we do have like a kind of a list of technologies, a bit of a tech radar, if you will, of things that are paved and battle tested, and we know are going to like productionize fine. And we tend to like ask people to choose from that list, which, ideally that list is ever changing as we adapt new technologies and figure out, what is something to lean more into or maybe lean away from.
And then in terms of how you engage with the different groups and engineering teams throughout Wayfair, I'm wondering if you're focused primarily on greenfield projects, or do you also embed with existing product teams to figure out whether to either incorporate Python for bits of tooling or to replace bits of their application? I'm just wondering if you can sort of characterize some of the decision factors that go into who you work with and for what particular end goals.
Yeah, maybe actually, if it's helpful, maybe I could walk that back a little bit. So we engage with teams in a variety of ways, which we got into a little happenstantially. So when we first got the platform team off the ground, as all my Python experience as it may be, I actually hadn't worked on a Python team at the company before, so I didn't really know like what the pain points were, what problems we actually needed to solve to be really effective. So we had this idea of like, well, what if we just spent a decent amount of time, just working with teams on their projects? So you can imagine like one person on the back end trying to like smooth out points of friction, and one person going out and just like pairing with teams on what their problems are, seeing where the friction is, and then bringing that knowledge back to the team, while also maybe like giving someone some expertise on their project to learn from. And so we ended up like leaning into that pretty hard. It worked really well. And we developed a program out of it called auxiliary engineering. So you can imagine half of the platform team roughly spending between like 2 and 3 quarters a year working with teams on projects as part of those teams. So that's probably our largest investment, where we tend to spend a lot of times like planning that out, setting expectations, and those engagements last about a quarter. And then you can walk all the way back to light touch things such as ad hoc support, office hours, where we encourage people to come up and chat with us, or just digging in with the team on a random question. The auxiliary engineering one, though, in particular, we've gotten a lot of value and mileage out of that, and it's become a pretty integral part of how we run our platform teams internally.
And are there any analogous groups throughout Wayfair that are serving to support other technology stacks or languages, or is this something that's unique to Python?
Well, it used to be unique to Python. It was something that was going well enough that we decided to apply the same exact model to other languages. So I think about a year and a half, if I'm remembering this correctly, after starting Python platform, we spun up PHP platform, and we have been trying to build out largely the same type of team and roll out the same model in that ecosystem. And we're about, I think, just about a year into building out a similar ecosystem over there.
And for the groups that you work with closely, can you talk about some of the just overall day-to-day of how your team works with the other engineers and
Sure.
some of the sort of the length of a typical engagement and maybe some of the common points of friction or confusion that exist with people who are familiar with other languages trying to adopt Python?
Yeah, definitely. So maybe I should start by, I'll just say here's what the general life cycle of one of these engagements looks like. We spend about 3 or 4 weeks trying to find a good group to engage with. We ask teams to basically solicit us for one of these. So it's generally a team approaching us saying, "Hey, we'd like you to come and partner with us on this MVP or this critical project." They would do that because you as the team asking for that, get a very experienced software engineer on your team to help you with a project. So that's very attractive. And we tend to look at these in 3 dimensions: business impact, technical impact, and team culture fit. So we're essentially trying to hopefully get like a little over what we can take on in terms of bandwidth and choose the one that is highest leverage or impact across those dimensions. Once we find that, we do a round of expectation and goal setting where we just make sure that we're well aligned. We know what success looks like. We know what pitfalls we want to avoid. And then the engagement lasts about a quarter, give or take a few weeks. And during that time, we do weekly retros. We do a project retro at the end. It's pretty intense and ambitious, and we're trying to bring a lot of change into the team while we're also trying to achieve these really ambitious business goals. And during that entire time, we're also learning a ton firsthand about our own platform. My favorite example of this would be if you go and work with a team and they have a new engineer that just joined the company, maybe a junior engineer, they're seeing your ecosystem for the first time. You see them struggle on something, and it's really hard to feel that pain, like as maybe someone who's very familiar with Python or specifically Python at Wayfair. You see that and you say, that's an opportunity for improvement. We make sure that auxiliary engineers have like 20% time to just jump on those things without having to go through any process. And if you fix it that week and you get back to the person and say, "Hey, I saw you struggle with this, with this maybe documentation or automation have helped that," feels great. And that person sees that, hey, being vocal and just like sharing my the pains I'm going through with the team led to actual meaningful change very quickly. In terms of failure modes that we try to avoid or where we've struggled, there's really, I think of like 3 projects that come to mind. One was more or less on us. We undersized pretty significantly the challenge of migrating something from 2 to 3. And we still had a really big impact. It was just that process took up a lot more time than we thought it would, mainly because there was a lot of dependencies that also had to be brought over in that migration to get over the finish line. And the other 2 challenges we've faced were largely, I would say, externalities. One team lost a few key sponsors on their side of things right after the project got off. And the other one, the engineers that were supposed to work with us on the project had to stay on a previous project because it was having some issues getting over the finish line. And, you wouldn't want to sabotage that project to get the new one up and running. That probably wouldn't be the right thing to do. So some of those are, we have lessons learned. In general, the main takeaway we've had is if we do see an issue in being able to engage the team effectively and some of the failure modes hit the surface, we want to be pretty aggressive about calling it early end to the engagement. Because at the end of the day, our team isn't super large. It's I think it's like 5 or 6 people. So you want to be very thoughtful about where you're spending your time. And if you don't have that full buy-in from the team, calling it early generally is the right thing to do.
And in terms of identifying people who would be strong candidates to work in your team to help proselytize and educate people on proper uses of Python and how to engineer it appropriately, What's the sort of selection criteria for figuring out if they would be a good fit, and some of the overall skill set, either technical or otherwise, that you found to be most effective?
Yeah, definitely. So it's I would say it's a pretty interesting team to be a part of. We deal with a lot of ambiguity. It's oftentimes not as clear cut as, make this change to hopefully make, the product more effective. Sometimes you really have to figure out where the points of friction is or the ambiguity in your own platform. So we like people who are feeling really comfortable just figure out that ambiguity space, and are okay navigating it. Also, we found that it's like, obviously, someone that enjoys helping someone else, either through education or training or pairing, to become more effective, because we are a meta team. Like, people who really feel a sense of reward in seeing others become more effective and successful, that tends to pair really well with our platform team and these types of engagements in general. I'd say our team generally skews pretty senior as a whole, and we try to attract the best Python engineers in the organization to this team, so that we can figure out how to replicate their knowledge as effectively as possible across the entire organization.
And then within your team, I'm wondering if you have found that there are some either useful training materials or sort of project scaffolds that you can use to hit the ground running when you're working with other groups, or useful tools or libraries that you've been able to leverage either within projects that are helpful for you internally to have sort of reusable patterns, or tools that have been particularly helpful for some of the other teams that you've worked with.
So that's I'm glad you asked that, because this is one of those funny stories where very early on we had this example project that we had written for, like, hey, here's how you can structure Flask and use blueprints and get the best like project structure versus like maybe throwing everything into a couple files unstructured, like which is almost like, I think by default, if someone's coming into Flask, they tended to create like these what would you say, monolithic files that just had everything in it. That's what we were seeing some of. So as we helped give some guidance there, we then realized, well, people are like copying this template, or not template, but example project. They're just like replacing their own stuff in it. Cookie Cutter is an awesome framework for this. Why don't we just build some Cookie Cutter project templates for people to use? And at the same time, we were thinking, oh, everyone has to figure out logging and metrics. Why don't we write some libraries and write them really well so they're extremely intuitive to use? We'll call those like core libraries. And that'll mean like, oh, if you're creating your project, like, here's a logging library. It just solves it all for you. You can get up and running, and logging is kind of just good to go. Same with metrics and a few others. So the combination of those two ended up incredibly powerful. Teams would just like clone a Cookie Cutter project, and as we spin up Docker, whatever it was that we started to add into the template, like, they just get all that for free. And that cut through so much boilerplate for the teams that they really became a core strategy for the platform, where we're also building that up in other ecosystems now as well, just like core libraries plus a Cookie Cutter template. And I think you can really see the mark that it left on the organization, because generally if you walk around and you ask someone about project templates, they get called cookie cutters just because that's the framework that we happen to use. And I think not a lot of people realize that was the name of the framework versus like what we were just calling the project template. So Cookie Cutter is quite a well-used templating system at Wayfair these days.
Yeah, so it's got the Band-Aid problem where the brand name has become synonymous with the actual technology.
Yes, exactly.
And then as far as some of the particular types of projects that you've been engaged with, I'm wondering if there are any sort of common patterns or categories of things that you have found that other teams have been asking for help with, or if it's sort of all across the map and just some of the interesting or unexpected types of projects that you've been engaged with there.
There's really been a lot. We typically don't use Python like in the customer facing experience, like the e-commerce experience. That's very much like a very massive PHP application. But behind the scenes, it's used all over the place. And oftentimes what you'll end up seeing is a team has maybe seen another team be really effective, say, standing up a Python application to consume and leverage like Kafka queues, for example, and they've seen that go really well, and they're interested in that, but they might not have the existing experience on the team to just like go and take it on themselves. So that's one thing that we've definitely supported a lot, where there seems to be like Python is a great use for this problem, but we don't have people today who really understand the language. It would be awesome to have someone come from the platform team and just like partner with us for a quarter to get up to speed. I think a lot of our big success stories look something like that.
And then you mentioned that at this point, you're up around 5 or 6 engineers. When you started, it was yourself and one other individual. So I'm wondering how the overall scale and scope of your work has changed, and some of the evolution of your stated mission and some of the ways that you're trying to make yourself known within the organization so that people are even aware that you exist as a resource for them.
Yeah, so we actually got started with 3 people, and early on, it was very much like you can imagine, you inherit this platform that's kind of been more or less built out over volunteer time from other teams, and we pretty much start in like behind the curve, underwater stage, and we had to figure out how to put out some existing fires, but also looking at like what do we think this platform can be in the future. So right out of the gate, what we did was we leaned into like 20% time. So every Friday was pretty much like self-directed, forward-looking. So no matter more or less how underwater we felt like we were at least carving out a day a week to really look at the future. And then we tried to strike a balance between, I would say, just kind of like pushing the platform forward and making sure like what we're doing is actually providing values to teams. And it feel like for about a year or so, it was a lot of iteration on that. We started to grow the team. We had another person join who helped us get the auxiliary engineering program off the ground, really, where we started to like formalize it. And it felt like the value we were providing teams and the leverage we were giving them was started to become more and more recognized. And within a year and a half, actually, like the team had developed a brand. You saw like auxiliary engineering become something that not just engineers were talking about, but product people were talking about, because they're like, wow, this platform team came over and they worked with our team. And I suddenly like saw a lot of really strong outcomes. They were moving so fast. And some of it was because we were bringing expertise, but also being close to infrastructure, we could help them cut straight through maybe some of the stuff that might be confusing if the first time you have to interact with it. And today, I would say it's actually a pretty integral part of Wayfair's technical strategy, is to figure out how to grow this platform focused effort in a way that really, really maximizes how much time engineers spend on delivering, or focusing on their core projects, and minimizing how much time they spend on toil, to use a word, and things that are ultimately like not directly related, but generally are like have to be done. Again, like maybe standing up or figuring out how to like get like the logging stuff integrated. We just want to keep people focused on the meat of their problems, and I think that's at this point just really widely recognized. And the branding and marketing side of it internally is like I felt like we've kind of grown past that being an issue at this point.
And then for the teams that you're working with, particularly those who don't have any in-house experience using Python, I'm wondering what you have found to be some of the common stumbling blocks or points of confusion or pain points that they've encountered while trying to adopt Python and build things with it or incorporate it into their existing infrastructure and products.
Yeah, totally. I think Python has a pretty good testing culture these days, and I actually didn't recognize this until I had a chance to compare it. But I was kind of one of those Python engineers that really lagged in kind of like looking at type annotations and kind of embracing them. So I like really I kind of stuck it out for like, no, I like my dynamic systems, and what I didn't realize is that I was relying on very strong test suites to give me some of the same assurances that like a statically typed compiled language would give you. So when people are coming from maybe Java or .NET or a similar language, they kind of squint at Python a little bit and go like, well, like, what do I think we've all been engaged in this conversation before, but getting them to understand like, yeah, right, Python has typing limitations now. You can or should lean into those in my opinion. But your test suite is also like, Python has an amazing set of tools for writing some really, really like high value tests, not tests that just give you like an uptick in your coverage, but actually like hopefully break at some point and save your butt at some point. So that's one that we really try to like help people figure out. Code review is just a pure, has nothing to do with Python, but we've noticed like spreading some code review best practices is a pretty big lift for teams. We tend to advocate that like code reviews should like if you have good linting pipelines, like you pull style feedback out of code reviews. If you treat code reviews as like really urgent, like even more important than writing your own work, then like you don't have things getting bottlenecked in code review, and like teams are generally amazed at how fast they start to move once they remove that bottleneck. And I would say one thing I'd shout out to Jack Diedrich is his Stop Writing Classes talk. That's one of my personal favorite Python talks. It changed the way I write Python when I first saw it. People, again, coming from like a very Java-like language, tend to want to like put one class in one file. And if you watch that talk, getting teams to think about Python as like, well, you don't actually need to use a lot of classes. Your files are there to help you organize things, not necessarily using the same way that you see in Java. Bringing some of those changes into the team tends to be a common tripping point, but one that like once you get someone to really see the value of like concise code that's very easy to read and contribute to, it generally takes.
And then in terms of the projects that you have worked on and built up, what are some of the notable successes, and what are some of the cases that you've run into where you ended up having to abort the engagement because of either issues at the technical level or organizational pushback or just a poor team fit?
Yeah, we've had quite a few wins. I think that we've done somewhere between 12 and 15 of these engagements. A number of them have exceeded the goals of the engagement, and we were into like stretch goals by the end. We've worked on systems ranging from computer vision, our pricing systems, finance. We have a lot of our search tech is Python, and we've worked in that space. There's a pretty interesting problem around like how you actually move products to customers' houses, and we've worked with that. We've recently even built out systems that are part of a pretty critical workflow, the order processing pipeline that actually takes a completed order and does all the necessary things with it. So we've worked with quite a few. I would say there's actually only been one engagement where we ended early, and that was one where ultimately like the team that we were supposed to pair with wasn't. They were stuck working on a different project and weren't able to engage. And if we want to think about the priorities of these engagements, we explicitly set them as priority number one is transform the team in some way. So make them more comfortable working with Python as a technology, or you can imagine like some type of behavioral change that we want to stick past the engagement. That for us is priority number one. Priority number two is actually like effectively hitting the project goals. And that's very explicitly order them in that way, because if the auxiliary engineer is just taking on all the hard work themselves, that's actually not, like for us, that's a failure. That's not going to actually have a lasting impact on the team the way we would want. So we may, in this case, like it's important that we kind of like pull the ripcord, because we're ultimately not able to hit number one if no one's there working with us on the project.
Another thing I'm wondering about is if there have been any common patterns as far as the groupings of languages that the teams you're working with have been familiar with, and if you have seen any patterns as far as language camps that have refrained from working with you because they're happy enough with their own feature set and they don't feel the need to explore Python?
It's a really interesting question. I don't think I've actually thought about that before. I think we see a pretty broad mix. I think maybe, if I had to, it's really hard because at the end of the day, PHP is a very prevalent language at the organization. So we do see a fairly large number of PHP apps who are like maybe switching to Python for something, but that might actually be proportional to how much PHP is used. So I don't think I have a great answer there, but I do think it's a general mix. And we haven't actually, at least not to the point where we've said, oh, people who are using .NET refuse to write Python. Nothing like that has really stood out at any point for us.
Another thing that I'm curious about is because of the fact that you're working with people who are familiar with all these other different languages, if there are any design patterns or lessons that you have brought back into your work in Python and your team's work in Python as a result of working with those other teams and some of the ways that they approach technology and system and software design.
Yeah, I think so. From a software and system design perspective, nothing jumps out. That doesn't mean that hasn't happened, but nothing's just coming to mind at the moment. But I definitely say it is a bidirectional knowledge share when we're engaged with the team. We learn a ton from the teams, especially around our own platform. And I'm sure we consider it a goal to absorb best practices from teams. We don't view ourselves as essentially coming into the team as some elitists. It's actually, there's some intention behind why we call it auxiliary engineering and avoid some of the names that tend to imply supremacy, even if implicitly. So yeah, we're definitely looking for like what we can learn from our platform, and then how we can spread those best practices to maybe the next engagement or to ourselves. And I know that's happened quite a bit. The ones that come to mind are largely around, we've identified some rough patches that we weren't really fully aware of, where let's say we work with a team and they're like, oh, wow, getting up and running with this one particular thing was a lot more difficult than we would have hoped. And we hear that in a retro. And we really encourage that type of feedback because it's impossible for us to see it for the first time. And so when someone tells us that, we can like say, oh, great feedback. And then we can prioritize smoothing that out. And we definitely, that becomes a huge factor in how we set our own priorities and goals.
And so given the fact that you have been using and working on building with Python and encouraging the use of Python at Wayfair for a few years now, I'm curious how changes in the language and ecosystem of Python have changed the way that you approach it as a team, and also how the overall usage of Python at Wayfair has evolved over that same time period.
So I think when we first got started, there was just those handful of applications that we were supporting. There were the 12 or so, and one of the things that we leaned in on very early was Dockerized development environments and Dockerized CI pipelines. The applications themselves ran on a VM in production, but we wanted to make it easy for people to develop locally, and we decided like Docker was one of the best ways to make that development environment fairly reproducible and easy to engage with. That actually positioned us really well to adopt Kubernetes early on as we started to explore that. And Python was the first language to get into Kubernetes. And from when we started that to today, we went from being the first to having over 115 Python services running in Kubernetes. And so I'd say like we've seen the ecosystem grow tremendously. I don't remember how many people were in the Python help channel when we got started, but I remember looking at this just the other week, and it was, I think, over 500 people just in that channel. And that's a channel used for like asking other teams that are using Python help questions in general, just getting like kind of cross-team guidance or opinions on things. So we've seen quite a bit of growth. It's been really exciting personally.
For any other organizations or companies or groups who are interested in building a similar type of team or organization to encourage the use of Python and educate other engineers, what are some of the lessons that you have learned in the process or tactics that you have found to be particularly useful or helpful, or any other advice that you might give?
Yeah, totally. This is a great question because in retrospect, there was a lot of pitfalls that we tried to avoid that I think could like sabotage a team's effort as I try and navigate this. First of all, I think I get the impression that there's a lot of companies that have probably had some Python leak into their ecosystem just because of the data science traction that Python has, and like at some point you have to like figure out how to productionize that. Python becomes like maybe a pretty easy path to go down. So like I'm willing to bet there's a lot of organizations that like already have a little bit of Python, and similar to Wayfair a few years ago, they figure out, okay, what do we do with this? How do we do this properly? I would say this would be my guidance. Every ecosystem is going to be different, and what you want to do is, in my opinion, don't sit on the sidelines and try and think of what the perfect solution would be. Go and just work with the teams firsthand and see where they're struggling. Take that to heart and try and make that easy. Figure out how you like build some advocates both on the engineering but also on the product side when they see like Python being used to maximize its strengths, which I would argue, if someone were to ask me personally, like, why use Python? I think Python has this great story of being like, sure, it might not be the most performant language in languages if you straight up benchmark, but Python is so fast to get up and running and iterate on. If like speed to market is at all a concern, I think Python becomes an extremely strong option. In fact, if someone were to ask me very personally, I generally say that like someone has to convince me why not to use Python, because it's just such a good general purpose language, and there are plenty of use cases where it's probably not a good fit. But I want to see that case made before I personally would jump for it. Granted, I'm biased. I've been playing with Python since 2006 or so, but it's such a strong language. I think there's a lot of organizations that will find that very, very appealing. And my final advice would be, make sure you view the team as never a dependency or a gatekeeping team. You're there to pave roads and help other people figure out how to become more effective. In fact, if you become a dependency at any point, there's a serious risk that you will become swarmed with that type of activity, and you actually become incapable of moving forward in the platform. Let's say if you had everyone come through you before they like went out to production or something like that backlog would build up really fast potentially, and now you're spending all your time doing those activities instead of actually automating and innovating on things.
And are there any other aspects of your work on the auxiliary engineering team or your experiences of helping other groups within Wayfair learn and use Python that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Yeah, so I would say there's one thing that we did that was pretty cool early on. You can imagine a world where you have dozens and dozens of teams, all with maybe a couple of people doing something with Python. And early on, we felt it was really important to bring all those teams together, all those people using Python at Wayfair together, and kind of build a sense of community. I think Python in general, at least if someone's involved in the Python community, it tends to be very welcoming and supportive. And I find that trait also leaks onto the people who use Python at work. But what we did is we created an opportunity for teams to just come together and share what they were working on in Python. And then we gave out a bunch of mugs that were co-branded with like a Python logo and a Wayfair logo, a little gimmicky, but you'd be really surprised, I think, how those mugs became a pretty sought after item where people would kind of like see it on your desk and know that like, oh, someone doing something in Python, and then you go and talk to them. So I think there's a lot of times opportunities to build that community, especially if something is really dispersed in usage throughout the organization, and not like there's a center of excellence already for it. So thinking a little outside the box about stuff like that, I think it matters and it really helps. So we saw it become really successful. We actually saw at one point someone like trying to figure out where the mugs came from and offering to like buy it for $10. And and we just had a rule of like, if you want a mug, just come and talk to us and we'll give you one. But yeah, definitely like try to find a way to build a sense of community. We did that. It seems to have really paid a lot of dividends for us. And I'm willing to bet the same story will play out in pretty much any organization.
All right. Well, for anybody who wants to get in touch with you or follow along with the work that you're doing, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to share a podcast that was started by a listener of this show who contacted me to say that through listening to the episodes, it motivated him to start his own thing. So it's a show about learning Bayesian statistics. So I'll add a link to that to the show notes for anybody who wants to check that out. And with that, I'll pass it to you, Jonathan. Do you have any picks this week?
Sure. I'll throw out two that we really like. I'll bucket the first one together, which is like Pydantic and Fast API. We really like those. We have a lot of Flask apps right now, and for a number of them, I feel like Pydantic and Fast API might be a bit of an upgrade. So we're trying to lean into those and make those a little easier to adopt internally. And so far, I personally really like those frameworks, and I think they seem like they have some pretty bright futures. The other one that I would throw out there is MKDocs. If anyone hasn't checked it out, we personally it's been my favorite framework for getting documentation up and running, especially with like some of the themes that are out there. Like we use Material a lot. We made that easy to use, and we found that teams just started like gravitating towards it like wildfire because it makes it so easy to get some really, really attractive looking documentation up and running quickly.
All right. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share your experiences of working on the auxiliary engineering team at Wayfair and helping other groups throughout learn and take advantage of Python. So I appreciate your efforts on that front, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, Tobias. Thanks for having me. This was awesome.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.